Welcome everybody. This is Mara Elaine and this is another episode of the Earth and Cosmic Wisdom series. And these are conversations for these evolutionary times with people I've met on my own journey and path, and wisdom keepers who are steeped in different wisdom traditions and indigenous practices, from permaculture and earth wisdom traditions all the way through to astrology and the more esoteric sciences. And today we're bridging from Ireland across to Guatemala and Lake Atitlán. I hope I've pronounced that right. And I have a man with me today called Mark Elmy. And Mark is a Mayan spiritual guide who works with Mayan astrology. And I met Mark last summer with his beautiful partner traveling in Ireland at some of our most sacred sites over here. And again in Glastonbury, so Spirit really was weaving to have us meet along on the pathway. And Mark, a little bit about him. He was born actually in England and he moved to Guatemala around 12 years ago after being deeply immersed in studying Mayan astrology from as early as 1998, when he began studying the Mayan calendars specifically. And he studied with elders in Guatemala, and in 2015, he received his initiations as Ajq'ij, or Mayan spiritual guide. And since then, he has really been offering his daily readings of the energies within the sacred Mayan calendar on and through his website, which is the4pillars.net, which I will share below. And he also gives personal readings and teaches courses on Mayan astrology. He is also a firekeeper or a ceremonialist, which I experienced, having experienced one of his fire ceremonies in Glastonbury. And these ritual offerings are, and in with the calendar, are actually to promote balance within the local community and in our greater global community. So I'm delighted to welcome Mark today, and just to dive into the wisdom that you're carrying over there and into that whole area. I'd love to hear a lot more about it. So welcome, Mark. Lovely to have you.
Thank you. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, lovely to see you. It was such a synchronistic meet with you, and it was last summer, right? Because there is a bit of a time warp in these times, that we met in Ireland.
Yeah. I think it was just about this time last year, actually.
There we go.
Yeah.
Which was so synchronistic. I think, well, we met first actually at the heart of Ireland on the hill of Ajq'ij, which was a perfect spirit meet or spirit connect, and then on to Newgrange. And I think the following week we ended up meeting on the street in Glastonbury.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'd love to talk to you first off about, you know, you've been there at it's Lake Atitlán, right? Is that how you say it?
That's right. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear about your experience living there and just to date the energies there and what that represents for you.
Well, you know, the first time I came to Atitlán was in 1999. And at that point in time, I was living in England in a relatively, let's say, a job that I fell into. And it wasn't exactly what I could see myself doing for the rest of my life, let's say. And I decided, right, okay, it's time to travel. It's time to spread my wings. And I've been introduced to the Mayan calendars about a year before that. And I just decided, right, okay, that's that. I got to go. And so I sold my house. I quit my job. I left the country and I went traveling. And I spent about 7 months moving around Mexico and Central America, exploring down here. And so the first time I came to the lake, I think it was in August of '99. And I actually came to San Marcos, the town that I lived beside. Back then, it was a really different place, but it was simply one of the most beautiful places that I've ever been in all of my travels. I think Aldous Huxley compared Lake Atitlán to, he said it's like Lake Como with the embellishment of volcanoes. So it's a really, really, really special place. Now, there is much more to it than just that, because it's like you come here and you get wowed by the volcanoes, you get wowed by the lake. But when you start to scratch below the surface, you find a heck of a lot more that's in there as well, especially this area. Now, much of Latin America, once it was invaded by the Spanish, you'll find that, like, sometimes it would be, you could almost look at it and say it's difficult to know what country you're in, because there's the usual kind of like dusty Latin American towns. But then you've got certain places where, let's say, the conquistadors couldn't reach or couldn't reach so easily. And so the culture remains preserved. You've got places like Bolivia, like parts of Peru, you know, especially the highland parts. And here in the highlands of Guatemala, we have the same. And so in the villages that I live between, we'll find that people will only speak Spanish if they're trying to speak to somebody like me. Because if they're speaking to each other, they speak Sotahil in San Pablo or Cachiquel in San Marcos. That's the preservation. The preservation of language goes hand in hand with the preservation of tradition. And so when it came to 2008, I decided to leave the country again. I went back to the UK, you know, I did got back to work, set up a company and all that kind of thing. And then in 2008, I just decided that for me, I needed to reach out from the UK. I needed to be somewhere else. I needed to create my life. And I needed to live in an environment which was more flexible and adaptable to that kind of creativity. A young country that was developing rather than an old country which had so much set in stone already. And so it was a very obvious choice to come here. And that's where everything started to roll out. Now, one of the things that I found about living here is that you need to be super adaptable. You can't rely on the ideas or concepts that you have in a nation like England or somewhere like that. I built a house, I've done all sorts of things while I've been here. And I've had to learn a great amount of things. And earlier this year, I kept having this theme come up, which is that comfort kills creativity. We're trying to make our lives more comfortable. We're trying to better ourselves in one way or another. And it's because we get faced with a challenge that we have to learn how to adapt, how to overcome, and how to make things work. Right. And when you want to thrive, that is a key. So that key comes from your creativity, and your creativity, like any muscle, when you exercise it on a regular basis, it grows. And so you become more and more creative. You become more and more adaptable. And this is what happens when we're faced with challenges. Now, here I am talking to you today over this video link in real time and all of this kind of thing from the highlands of Guatemala, from a fiber optic cable link that I now have put in here, which 10 years ago would have been unthinkable. 10 years ago when I arrived here, if you were trying to send an instant message or whatever through something like Skype or MSN or whatever it was that we had then, just one line of text, you watch the hamster wheel. There was no Wi-Fi, there was no internet, there was kind of, you had to go to an internet cafe, you know, all of that kind of thing. In the last 10 years, I've seen stuff develop at I'd say an alarming rate. I don't mean to put a negative spin on it. It's an amazing rate that things have moved at here and that are allowing us to step into this world. But still we have the same things. Our transport, our infrastructure is rather challenging here. The roads aren't so good. There's all sorts of local quirks that you have to learn how to work with. But there is also, in addition to adaptability, tolerance is something that you have to learn here. You have to learn, like, the harder you try and push against something, it's like you're pushing against it with your head. And eventually it's just going to end up hurting. So you have to learn this gentleness, this acceptance, and knowing what to nudge in the right place at the right time in order to actually produce the result that you are hopefully aiming for. But, you know, it's like there's certainly a lot that you learn from being in this different culture. Now, that's what we might call the surface part. Atitlán, you know, one of my friends here, or friends from the States, he kind of like said that Atitlán was kind of like Central America's Sedona. That's the energy that he put it with.
Right.
And I kind of like get what he's saying about that. And it is the whole lake in one way or another. We have this massively deep lake, the deepest lake in Central America. It used to be about 85,000 years ago. It was a super volcano that exploded and filled up with water. And so it's a very powerful energetic center. We now have, over the other side of the lake, we have 3 volcanoes, San Pedro, Toliman, and Atitlán, which are all, well, San Pedro and Toliman, I think they're pretty safely extinct. Atitlán last went up about 150 years ago or something like that. So I don't think we can really class it as totally extinct, but we'll see about that.
Exactly.
But it's just so beautiful here. Now, what we also see is that under this lake, there is an ancient city. There is an ancient temple site under Lake Atitlán. Right now, it's called Samabaj, which is kind of named after the explorer that discovered it. It's actually one of my neighbors. And Atitlán used to be the midway point, or a stopping point, between the Pacific coast and the lowland jungles, where many of the big temple sites are. And we're going back 2,300 years with this. They reckon that Samabaj went underwater about 2,300 years ago. That's what I say.
Wow. And when was it discovered, Mark?
1998.
Wow.
There'd always been rumors about a city under the lake, and lots of people had dreamed about a city under the lake. And my friend's a diver. He went down, he found this place. There's actually a great National Geographic documentary about it called either Mayan Blue or Mayan Atlantis. And it shows kind of like some of the exploration of this temple site. It's not got big pyramids, but it's got stelas and altars and structures and all that kind of thing under it.
Right.
So what would happen is that people would come across from the Pacific coast, because of Atitlán being a massive water source, of course. You've got to cross this mountain chain, which runs all the way from Argentina up to from Chile up to Alaska, where the 2 plates, where the Pacific plate comes in. Right. So you've got to find a way across it. Now, when you're on a long journey, what you need, of course, is a water source, and Lake Atitlán is a massive fresh water source. And so what the people would do would be coming in at the lowest point, which is San Lucas Toliman. They would come across the lake, they would stop to make offerings at the site now known as Samabaj, before they would then take the journey across to Tsunaná and back over the other side down into towards the east of the country. And so you can imagine they're on this journey and they stop at this sacred site in this sacred lake. And what we find when we go into the pyramid sites, they often have what we call triadic structures, like a triad, 2 little temples in a pyramid on top of all of these like pyramidal structures. Right. And that could easily represent the 3 volcanoes of Lake Atitlán, because that's how sacred this place is. Oof. So as I say, when I came to live here, there was certainly a reason, which was the culture. Yeah. Because I wanted to learn about the Mayan culture from authentic culture, which is, let's say, the least disturbed. I came to be amongst the beauty, and for the climate, we've probably got the most perfect climate for human existence here in Atitlán. And I came to learn about the energy here. Now, the energy here, if you can imagine, we have this lake which is somewhere around about 350 meters deep in the middle. And it's not that big, so it's basically like that. It is extremely feminine. It is a very, very, very feminine place to be. And then we have the mountains on the other side of the lake, which are exactly the opposite. They are literally like that. 3 huge stratovolcanoes.
Wow.
And where do we live? Well, we live on the shore between the masculine and the feminine.
Oh.
And so this is a place of incredible balance, because you've got this massive earth energy from the volcanoes. You've got this deep feminine energy from the lake. And we live in the balance point on the shore. And this is what the lake calls us to do. And it can be very disconcerting for those who are not yet in balance.
Right. Yeah.
The lake is rather like it can welcome you with open arms. And if you adapt and change and balance, then you enjoy a very happy life here. But if you're stuck in your patterns, if you're stuck out of balance, it will bring everything up that is out of balance to be looked at.
Right.
And if you're too afraid or you won't look at it, it just keeps pummeling you. And quite honestly, you know, we've sometimes seen like the helicopters taking people out who have it is a very, very intense energy. And so, yeah.
And even it's like Sedona for me. I've lived there many cycles of time, but it is like hyper concentrated like that as well. But we don't have the water as we have a little bit of water, but not the same as having that deep reservoir. So I can feel that, like, wherever you're out of whack, it's just hyper accentuated, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's like you know, if you put a small dent in a wheel, you know, the faster that wheel goes, the more vibration it will create. And I see, you know, if we talk about vibration, for example, when we talk about raising our vibration, well, that means our frequency gets higher, our wavelength increases. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is that if you tie a pencil onto a wheel, you can actually, when you turn the wheel, you create a wave-like pattern, because the two are mathematically compatible. Right. Now, if we think of the wheel, if we imagine raising our vibration, the higher we raise our vibration, the higher we raise our frequency, the faster that wheel spins. Now, in order for that wheel to continue spinning faster, we need to make sure that we've rubbed out any imperfections on that wheel. Because the more we raise our vibration, the faster the wheel goes, the more it will vibrate. And you might have experienced that in your car. You know, if you have a tire that goes out of balance, or you hit a curb or something, you'll be all right up until about 50 miles an hour, and then the whole thing starts juddering or something like that.
Right.
Well, the same, I feel, is true about us and our vibration, our frequency. And there are certain places that are pushing your frequency to raise. They're pushing that wheel to go faster. And so they're bringing attention to any imperfections on the surface of the disc that are going to cause that flutter, that inability to keep balance.
That's huge. I can feel the potency of that land, and it's been calling me for so many years, but it just hasn't been time yet. You know, and I feel like there are other places that also bring in the positive and negative, you know, vortex points, which will bring in that balance point as well and challenge it, right? But yeah, I mean, that's a powerful place to manifest then, and to, I mean, obviously your soul just felt you know, inexplicably linked to that place for, you know, the amount of years that you've been able to ground there. Yes.
Yeah, it was something which I think once I got here on a more permanent basis, I knew this was pretty much the place in the world that I wanted to be. And like everywhere else, that doesn't mean my life's perfect. And it doesn't mean that I don't get frustrated by certain things from time to time. But I would certainly say that the joy that I experience living here more than outweighs the challenges that I experience living here, let's say.
Right.
And I think that's what it's about. You know, it's kind of like, because when you can gather that joy, when you can use it, being part of somewhere. You know, my feeling. I remember reading somewhere that they say that every cell in our body replenishes every 7 years. So every 7 years we're completely renewed. Well, one of the things that we may miss out of that equation is what we're renewed with. Because what we're renewed with are the atoms that make up the molecules, that make up the cells of what we take into our body. Now, we think obviously a lot about the food that we'd be eating. Well, the food came from the ground where we are. And my feeling is that some way it's energetically imprinted with the energy of the area in which it's grown. The same with the water that we take in. The same with the oxygen that we breathe that came from the trees and plants that are around where we're living. And the carbon dioxide that we're exhaling, which is then going to nourish the trees and the plants around where we are. And so we literally become a product and a part of the environment in which we live. Now, if we say that after 7 years, if everything is renewed, then you're literally made of the environment that you're around. And I think, for me, certainly, it felt like after 7 years of being here, I certainly feel quite naturalized about being here. Yeah. When I come back to the UK, for example, I kind of feel much more like a tourist. And, you know, if I bring a friend from Guatemala with me or something like that, they're like, well, how does this work? And I'm like, your guess is as good as mine right now, quite honestly.
Right. Well, you're in right relation with your space and with the land that you're in. So you really have become part of that landscape now.
Yes, absolutely. And in the last few months, particularly with what we've been working with, what we've been dealing with, it's reminded me that one of the reasons why I came was certainly to focus on my studies of the Mayan cosmology, my studies of the Mayan calendars and that kind of thing, but also to live a life which was more harmonious. And part of that was growing my own food, having my own chickens, and doing all those things that I would have liked to have done anywhere else, you know, but like seeing that here I really have the opportunity to. And, you know, this is getting out and getting in touch with the earth. And quite honestly, for myself, in the last few years, I got busy with other stuff. I've forgotten about kind of like the initial ideas. And then when we're faced with what we've been faced with recently, it's like, you know what? I need to look at my food sovereignty. I need to look at this. I need to look at that. I need to get back in touch in a much more properly earthy way with this place here. Right. And, you know, I'm sure that you and many the viewers kind of like also recognize how good that lettuce that you pick right there and then, those tomatoes, all of that food that comes straight from your environment that you put your love into. There's something really, really special about that. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity to reconnect with my land in that way as well.
Yes, I think we've all gotten that wake up call for sure. And anywhere that we have not been in that connection, that sacred connection with the land, it's all expedited, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said earlier, opportunities. It's kind of like giving us the time to reconnect. It's giving us if we've managed to not binge watch Netflix for the last couple of months or something like that, which is, you know, it's fine. We will do it from time to time or whatever. But there's other stuff out there that it's like once you've got to the point where there's nothing else you want to watch, you're looking at what other projects can I do? And then you find it, hopefully I do anyway, a lot more satisfying to get out, get your hands in the earth especially when like the fruit of your labors literally comes back to you.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Yeah, I agree 100%, you know, and it's just doing what you can with what you've got and working from that place as well, you know.
Absolutely.
I love that. And you know, what I'd love to ask you about is the traditional people there and the culture with the locals, really. I mean, are they in that ritual space a lot, or is there like different groups of Mayan people there that are more based in the ceremonial aspect of life? How does that work?
It's an interesting mix of tradition. And I have to, start by saying that one of the big, both threats to the culture and the spirituality here and that kind of thing, is the invasion of American evangelical churches into the culture. They started coming in during the Civil War because they were US backed, and so they were seen as a safe space to be. And
Right.
so they've taken over. And we have recently, in the last few months, actually had a lynching and kind of like a close to lynching of Mayan spiritual guides, because they're seen as witches and this kind of thing. And so, like, this is still a reality. Now, we also have the reality, which is there is a slight mix-up. We talk about syncretism, which is the mix between Catholicism and Mayan spiritual practice, which we see a lot around the place. And there's some things that people here do that they don't really realize what they're doing is actually Mayan culture, not Catholic culture. And then other times we'll see people that are doing something that they think is Mayan, but it's actually Catholic, because over 500 years, there's been an acceptance and blending of it. So we've got that going on as well. And then we have people like my teacher, who is like very much on the purely Mayan side of things rather than involving that. So we have several different layers and levels all going on at the same time. Now, an interesting story from 2009 was about the possession of San Marcos. And this was a really scary thing that sounds like it's straight out of some kind of like horror movie, but this happened, okay? There was some building work going on in the village. During the building work, the workmen dug up some bones. Now, having seen the way that things can work in England as well, I would say this is probably a worldwide thing. They dug up the bones and they thought, if we tell somebody about this, then they're going to bring in the experts, the work's going to stop, we want to press ahead with the job. So what did they do? They dug another hole and they put the bones into that hole, covered it up, sort of. Oh. Well, it turns out that they've disturbed something that they shouldn't have disturbed. And very shortly afterwards, young people in the village, they were kind of in the 13 to 21 age range, started having weird kind of like psychiatric breaks. They would be in the middle of their dinner, at which point they'd stand up, their eyes would roll back, they'd start talking weird languages and screaming and all sorts of terrible things. And this spread to around about 60 of these young people. They called in the Ministry of Health, they called in the Ministry of Environment, they called in all of these people to try and find a pathogen in the community. And there was nothing that they could find. In fact, what they found was that many of these young people weren't even linked. They didn't eat the same, they didn't drink from the same water source, and if they did, everybody else was drinking. There was just nothing that linked these people together. Right. And so eventually, the authorities came up with, this must be some kind of like spiritual thing. And so then the churches got together and they tried to work it out, and the Catholics being kind of like the big guns here, decided, right, okay, we'll sort it out. They called in the Bishop of Solomon, and he made a mass up in the cemetery of San Marcos. And they brought in these young people that were having these effects. And, you know, well, they didn't finish the Mass. They couldn't finish the Mass because the people were frothing at the mouth and screaming even worse than before.
Oh my
It just kind of like made the problem worse. And so eventually they bit the bullet and they said, well, you know, we're going to have to call in some Mayan spiritual guides, which is what they did. They called in 4 Mayan spiritual guides to come and make ceremony. They made 4 ceremonies. And during one of the ceremonies, one of the guides received the reason why this was happening. So it turned out that these bones that had been dug up were from about the 18th century, and they were people who had refused to convert from the old ways. They were people who were basically being starved to death in a pen because they were told, if you want to eat, you convert. And they chose not to convert. So they died. And what the spirits told the guide was that the young people here who were losing their way, and they needed to remember their ancestral traditions. They needed to remember to become Ajq'ij, to become firekeepers, to become midwives, to become bone setters, to become herbalists. All of these traditions are within Mayan spiritual practice.
Right.
It was just after that we saw altars beginning to be reset. Now, funnily enough, I only came across the whole story about the rest of it. You know, it wasn't so long ago, kind of like about 4 or 5 years ago or something like that. But what happened was that in 2010, this practice started happening. These altars started getting opened up. And in, I think it was 2013, 2014, one of my good friends in San Marcos was actually initiated as Ajq'ij, the first initiation that had been in San Marcos for about 35 years. And he's a young guy. I mean, he's not even 30 now. And so this was then followed by his wife, and then a friend, and then another friend, and then another friend. And so what we're seeing is that these young indigenous people from the village are starting to be initiated as Ajq'ij, which is like a resurgence. It's a new wave. When I first came here, of course, I came here to learn about Mayan spiritual practice. What happened when I came here and found out there was virtually nobody doing it? It was very, actually, even rare in this village. My teacher lives even further into the highlands up in Momostenango, which is very much more traditional than here.
Right.
And so what we've seen, and this is also kind of something I find quite interesting, is that post 2012, there has actually been a resurgence in authenticity. 2012, as you're probably aware, I'm sure that your viewers are aware, was this end of the Mayan calendar kind of thing, end of the 4th sun, beginning of the 5th sun, and all these kind of things, according to what we follow.
Yes.
And what we saw around that time is like we had massive tourism in 2012 because loads of people came here, end of the Mayan calendar, end of the world, I want to be at Tikal from the end of the world, and all of that kind of stuff that, you know, great, did wonders for the economy of the country, having all of that tourism. And then on 21st December 2012 or 22nd December 2012, when the ETs hadn't come down and saved us from ourselves, people were a bit disillusioned. They were like, oh, I was sure this was supposed to happen. And so there was almost a kind of like rejection of it. There was a kind of, oh, that didn't work. Well, like, quite honestly, when I asked my teacher about the whole 2012 thing about 2010, no, it's not really anything. It's more a North American thing than anything else. Now, it's not to say that there wasn't a shift, and it's not to say that there wasn't something wrong, but it was almost as like it was sensationalized into something that it wasn't. Now, we can look at it like this. Many people follow the Gregorian calendar, and many people say, oh no, I'm really not into that. It's like, well, on 31st of December, what do you do? Because many people will choose to go out to a party. They'll put a lot of time, effort, energy, money into what they're going to do to celebrate moving into the new year.
Right.
Now, you may feel a perception, a perceptible shift between where you were in August of 2019, where you are in August of 2020. Right, so we stepped into a different world. Did you have any perception of that at midnight on 31st of December 2019 or 1st of January 2020? I would say no, I didn't. I mean, I don't feel that kind of thing anyway, right? So what we see is that there is a changing point. Theoretically, the clock has ticked on to the next year. The calendar has changed on to the next year. We have passed the tipping point, but at that point in time, it's effectively like midnight on the clock. We haven't even seen the sun begin to show itself.
Right.
And this is where we look into the larger cycles of time, in particular 13, 26 or 52 year cycles. Now, what we have moved into is, according to the way that the Maya would see it, we've moved into the second half of a 13-year cycle that will take us from 2012, from 2013 through to around about 2025 or so, which is when the next cycle starts. And so we're just over the tipping point. So we can look on this as rather like being approaching dawn. Now, I'm very much into my astrophotography and this kind of thing. When you're doing that kind of thing, what you learn about is twilight. And when twilight comes, there are 3 twilights: astronomical, nautical, and civil. And they start generally about an hour and a half before sunrise, each one lasting about half an hour. So in Ireland, I don't know, what's your sunrise now? Somewhere around about 5 a.m.?
Around that.
Yeah. And so really, like, if you're awake at 3:30 in the morning, you can see that the sky starts to turn blue rather than black. It starts to shift, it starts to move. And that's where I see us right now. And we could look at sunrise actually being kind of like around about 2025. And what we're getting is the first glimpse of sunrise, what we're going to. We can also see these cycles, and that there is a 52-year cycle. And the cycle, like if we look back from 2020, we would find that 1968 carries a resonance with 2020. And what did we see in 1968? Assassination of Martin Luther King.
Mass revolution.
Exactly. It was all going on there. And when you talk to elders about the way that they see time, they don't see time as starting at point A, going to point B in a straight line. They see it as a spiral. And so this spiral is moving forward to give the understanding of a linear progression. But as it goes forward, it goes through a similar phase. So what we could say, if we looked at the spiral end on, we would see a circle, yeah? We could think of that as a clock face. So we could say that every time the spiral is at 12 o'clock, then we're going to go through a similar phase. Now, if we said that one revolution of that circle, well, that might be 260 days. It might be 365 days. It might be 13 years, or it might be 52 years. And so we will come into a space where we see a similarity. And if we know what happened that time, we can prepare for what's going to happen this time. And this, for me, is what following the calendar is all about. It's not saying I know what is going to happen, because nobody knows what's going to happen. But it's about saying, well, the last time that we experienced the energy of this day in this type of year, because there are 52 different types of years according to the Mayan calendars, this occurred. Now, if this occurred then, there's a possibility it's going to occur here. Right. And so we can prepare ourselves. We can prepare ourselves for a famine. We can prepare ourselves for insects. We can prepare ourselves for other things that come along. And we think, well, maybe this is just superstition. And well, does it really work like that? Now, one of the things that I particularly like to follow is the patterns of the planet Venus. I find them absolutely fascinating. And the Maya were really big into Venus. I mean, there's Venus alignments in so many of the temples here. There's literal Venus observation platforms built in architecturally to many of their temples. And when we look at things like this is the Dresden Codex, one of the few remaining Mayan books, and what we see is that these are literal Venus tables. This is all about the planet Venus and its movements over a period of 104 years. So Venus can appear in different ways, and it's just appearing, you might have seen it right now, it's beautiful in the morning sky. It's so high and bright. And it came into the morning sky in early June, which is mapped out in this. Now, if we look at what it actually shows in this, what we find is two figures. One of them is the death god, and the other one is the maize god. They're shown here and here. And it shows, sorry, that's the death god up here, and that's the maize god down here.
Right.
Now, death of the maize, what might that mean? Well, interestingly enough, what we have in the middle there is a warrior. And that warrior, he's kind of like got an insectoid kind of face. And I said, well, this is interesting because like this rather looks like that plague of locusts that's going through East Africa and Central Asia right now, rather looks like it's talking about that. And it's not about warnings and superstition. It's about timing. It's about understanding what's going on so that you can prepare yourself for what's about to happen, right?
Right.
Where does that timing come from? Well, the planets are not causing this. The planets are acting like hands on a clock that are helping us to tell the time. Because when we can correlate them with a calendar which does this, like the sacred calendar of the Maya, then we are able to prepare. Because if we know that there's a plague of locusts coming, then we can maybe put some kind of netting over our corn. We can take steps to prepare and protect that which is going to sustain us. So it's saying, hey, watch out for this in this year. You might still be thinking, well, how does that work? Well, you know that there are certain species like cicadas and locusts and that kind of thing, where every so often they swarm. So, for example, I think it was a 16-year cicada that's coming out in the United States right now, which is going to get really loud. Spends 16 years living underground, molts, climbs a tree, starts singing in order to breed. And it happens on this regular cycle.
Yeah.
That, which I just showed you, will happen about every 8 years. And maybe it's that these locusts have this 8-year cycle where every 8 years they form a big enough mass to cause a problem. And so we go into this calendar, we say, hey, protect your corn this year because there's bugs. And so this is the way that the calendar all weaves in with the tradition, it weaves in with the cycles of the planets, and it weaves in with the natural cycles of this land, gives people an understanding how to work. So going back to the 2012 phenomenon and all of this kind of thing is saying, right, okay, this is what's happening. Look to 1968, look to 1969, look at what was going on there. And you can understand how to prepare for this year. Maybe, you know, we could look at it from the point of view of like, if we're going to say, is it going to be a lean year or is it going to be a fat year? Well, if it's going to be a fat year, if we know that we're going to have lots of clients or we're, you know, kind of like everything's going really well, we can say, yeah, you know what? I think I might get a new car this year or those things that like are part of our life living in a developed nation. Right. Or we might say, you know what, this year, it's like when I've looked into it, it's supposed to be maybe a challenging year. So you know what, I'm going to hang on to my car and I'll change it in a couple of years' time or something like that. I know that the car is maybe a rather materialistic example.
Well, no,
it shows what I mean about it.
It's that's so beautiful. It's so true, and it correlates across the board, even with some of the Western astrological models that are all speaking to the harvest and the grain and the crops and minding our crops and that food sovereignty issue, right? Of just being conscious and aware of actually storing and putting stuff away and being a bit more careful.
Yes.
I love that.
Yeah, over the years we've become accustomed to certain standards. We've become accustomed to certain kind of, like, I don't know, things which they creep in, right? You know, it's kind of like, if we go back 15 years, I mean, or whatever, we look at, you know, how much you would have ordered online. It's like you might have ordered the odd thing or whatever, and it was just like, well, you know, I got that off eBay or you know, fledgling Amazon or something like that. And now we don't think twice about it. We're like, oh, I need this right now. And we click. And a day or two later, it's on our doorstep. You know, right. Sometimes quicker than that. And now we're reassessing that. We're reassessing that ability. And we're putting a value on what is around us. We're looking at these things which we've been given so much power to. And we realize that what's really important is survivability and adaptability where we are. Now, another one of the things which, let's say, helped me to decide to live in a country which I consider to be more robust was the truck drivers' strike of the year 2000. Now, this was something which was a real big wake-up call. And it also happened in Spain. I don't remember when, I think about 2005 or something like that, when, because of the price of diesel, the truck drivers went on strike. Now, I was working for a landscaping company at the time, and you don't realize the impact that these little things can have on what's considered to be a modern society. So within 3 days of the truck drivers striking, we were seeing things like petrol stations running out of fuel. We were seeing things like supermarket shelves being empty because everything works on this just in time, don't hold much stock in the stores and all that kind of idea. That when the resupply route is taken away, things run out very quickly. At the time, I was also living in a house which had an electric stove, electric heating, and like electric lighting. Everything was electric. I didn't even have a fireplace in there. If the electricity went off for a day or two because of a major storm, I couldn't even boil a kettle to make a cup of tea. And, you know, obviously being British, this is something which affects us majorly, right? Thankfully, I had a camper van and could go out and use a little gas stove in the camper van. Now, here in Guatemala, we have tropical storms, we have earthquakes, we have volcanoes, we have all sorts of stuff that comes through. And it may cause a landslide that cuts off the village for 4 or 5 days, or sometimes it will bring down the power lines for 4 or 5 days. And again, we have to adapt, we have to be more robust. And in that, we also have stores that have a bunch of rice, a bunch of dried beans, a bunch of all of these kind of things, or like every little tienda around this place, you can buy rice and beans and all of these dried goods, which, you know, we've become unaccustomed to in the way that our modern Western lifestyle has trained us out of it. We're not so prepared for calamity because we don't have to face it so often, which generally means that when a calamity does come along, everybody kind of freaks out. We're like, what are we going to do? How are we going to survive? Whereas here, we're naturally adapted to it. So once again, we've been through this big learning process, which has helped us to understand, right, okay, how can we become more robust in our lifestyle, more connected with the cycles of nature, more connected with ourselves. And we may have also had the time and opportunity to reconnect with home cooking rather than going out or relying on restaurants or deliveries or that kind of like, oh, actually, maybe I'll learn how to make it rather than rely on somebody else to make it. So once again, we see a great growth here. Now, this year, each Mayan solar year is a 365-day year. And right now it begins around about 20th of February. Next year it'll be the 19th because it's a 365-day year and it loses a day every 4 years compared to the Gregorian calendar. So right now it's, like I say, February 20th of this year was Mayan New Year. Next year it will be 19th of February. And the year that came in is called Atitlán. Ajq'ij Noch is the name. And Noch years are usually considered to be favourable years. Well, you can imagine, like, by the time March comes, year, really? What are you talking about? But the interesting thing is that Noch is about the mind, it's about the brain. And it also represents intellect and knowledge. And in particular, I see it as representing the left hemisphere of the brain more than anything else. The right hand is about how to come up with logical solutions. And the number 8 represents wholeness. It's about bringing everything together in one place. And so 8 Noch is about bringing all your knowledge together and using it to overcome situations. Now, whenever we go through, if we're going through school or university or whatever, then we're doing all our learning, and then we're doing our testing, and then we're writing our essays, and we're doing it with the help of our notes and that kind of thing. And then comes the exam. And in the exam, all of our crutches are taken away from us. Right? We have to just do it from what we got stored in here. And this, for me, feels like what this year is about. This is kind of like, this is the live fire exercise where we put all of our training into action. We have to go back. Why did we take that course? Why did we go on that course of learning? Why did we do all of this thing? Like sometimes we've been sitting on a bunch of knowledge that we've, for want of better words, or we've paid for. It's kind of like we've got all the certificates on the wall that say that we did this course and that course and that course. But what do we do with the learning? What do we do with the knowledge? What do we do with what we picked up? Well, here, we're putting it together. We're asking, we are being given that situation where we are being forced into thinking a different way about things. That way is no longer open. And in some ways, a dear friend of mine said to me a few weeks ago, said, we can't think about that world that we used to live in because now we're living in this world. And one way that I can see it is like there's a big wave of grief for the world that we used to live in. And grief, whilst it has its part, and whilst we've all been through situations where we've grieved the loss of loved ones and all that kind of thing, I don't want to belittle it too much. But if we spend too much of our time grieving for what's lost, we forget to look at what we have in front of us and make what we can out of what we have here. Because that world has ceased to exist. We're stepping into this world now, and we need to be focusing on what we have around us in order to make the best out of it.
Yeah.
Because we literally can't go back to what's behind us. And so Atitlán has given us the shake of a lifetime to wake up, to use the knowledge, to use the intellect, to use the abilities that we have in order to really kind of like work with our knowledge, our intellect, and bring out the best of what we can right now. Because there is no going back to what was last year.
What was many years, I think, of ways of living, right? Yeah.
Totally.
That's so important. What a great point. And it really does feel like that. It's that synthesis of what we already know and practical application, right?
Absolutely.
Of putting that all into practice. And I love what you spoke to about also that period, the 52-year cycle, up to like the 2025, maybe that's not the 52 year, but 2025 really feels like we are entering into a whole new eon like I can feel it energetically that we're tipping into that beautiful blue sky that you spoke of, and that feeling of opening into a new way, but there's still so much of the old still. We're still bound by so much of the old, right, that we still have to transition through.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that I see these 13-year periods, if we looked at it, we would have the period from 1961 to 1973. Well, that would equate to the period from 2013 through to 2025. Then we have 1974 through to 1986. And that would be the equivalent of like 2026 through to 2038. Worked out more or less correctly anyway. And so we can look back on each of those eras and see what was going on in each of them in order to prepare. And as I said, this is the way that we look at it, because you mentioned in your introduction that one of the roles of an Ajq'ij is to help to bring harmony to society. Well,
right.
We can bring harmony by people feeling comfortable in one way or another. Mm-hmm. So as I said, if you know that there's a plague of locusts coming, you know you need to plant a bit extra and you need to protect it better, because that way everybody can have food in their belly, for example. Because when a society is out of harmony, when a society is going through physical hardships, it's much more difficult for that society to thrive and flourish. You know, even we might sometimes we'll see calendars, oh, it's just an agricultural calendar. It's like, well, okay, we might be fasting from time to time, but quite honestly, if a spiritual practice means that people are starving, literally starving, then you'll find that that practice won't go on for very long. The whole point is to thrive in our planet.
Yes.
And to help others, help our community to thrive. And we do that through long-term vision, not through, as I often like to say, you know, if we think about short-term vision might be, we've discovered shale oil on our land, and so we call ExxonMobil to come and set up a fracking rig that's going to pollute the groundwater for the next generation. But we made our $1 million, so, you know, that's great. No, it's not about that. A long-term vision is seeing how our family, our children, and our environment can all thrive together. Because if one of those three doesn't thrive, the others will eventually fall.
Yeah.
So if our environment, if we are not looking after our environment with a long-term view on what the impact of our actions will be in 13 or 52 years' time, then we are not understanding how to correctly live on this planet.
Yes.
We have to look after everything to make sure that there is a world for our children, for our grandchildren. And I feel that the calendar, the understanding that we get from it helps us to live in harmony. It helps everything to thrive. Right. Again, somebody like I once read about how when we look back at exactly what we're doing, when we follow the food chain through, what we are doing is imbibing the energy of the soil. That's where everything comes from. If we have healthy soil, we have healthy plants. Those healthy plants will nourish us and we'll become healthy.
Yeah.
If our soil is out of balance, our plants need pesticides and fertilizers in order to survive in it. And then we take that in. Now, okay, you might say, well, we're taking in the chemicals that come from those fertilizers and that kind of thing. But really, what we're taking in is the out of balance energy that started off in the soil, started off in the earth. Exactly. So when we look after the earth in the first place, we don't necessarily need the artificial stimulants for the plants, because as plants grow healthy, because they're taking in the energy of the the right action from us in the first place. And so, in addition to looking after it in that way, we also understand that there is a time for everything. You know, timing is so important. If you right now in August in the northern hemisphere, in Britain island, for example, you might be planting some things. You could probably get away with planting some lettuce right now. You might get a crop of tomatoes if you grow them in a greenhouse before it gets too cold and all of that kind of thing. But in general, your days are beginning to get shorter. And it's very interesting. I used to have a landscaping, and I'd always thought that the trees turn yellow because it gets colder, that it's the cold weather that is the first frost that start to make the tree system shut down. It's not, it's the light. It's all about the light. So as the days get shorter, the trees sense this and they start to shut down the leaves and start to prepare themselves for the coming winter. And so when you're trying to grow stuff, even though you might have the right temperature, the fact that the days are getting shorter, the plants will take that into account. So really your prime planting season is going to be March, April time, when everything is so vital and going forward. Now we can also look at it. There is ancient, in particular Austrian practices, which talk about the phase of the moon, or rather the zodiacal sign that the moon is in, with regards to when you're going to plant roots or flowers, leaves or whatever.
Is that the biodynamic?
Yeah. And so when you look at it, it's kind of like you say, well, for me, it's all about, I look at it as in this way. One of my friends was swimming the English Channel last year. And what you have to do is you have to go out when the tide is high. You go out from Dover, and so the tide going out will carry you out to the middle of the channel. And then you have to time it so that you're going in on the rising tide taking you into Calais. And so, like, it doesn't matter how much you train. If you get the wrong tide, you ain't going to make it, because the tide is stronger than your own energy. Now, we can look at that from our own viewpoint of we might want to put our energy into something. But if we are trying to swim against the tide, we might make it if we are strong enough, but the chances are the tide will overwhelm us. And so when we get our timing right through understanding the sacred rhythm of time, through understanding that, for example, in the Mayan sacred calendar, we would plant on anil days, we would harvest on cat days, because they are the optimal.
Right.
And quite honestly, like for me, if I find a day when the moon is in Virgo, and it's a anil day within the Mayan calendar, sacred calendar as well, like that's it. I'm in the garden. No ifs, no buts. That's it. You know, this is a garden day.
Yeah.
And so, because it's like maximizing our efficiency.
Of course.
When we can go and, let's say, if we broke it down into calories, if we can spend 500 calories planting and tending to our garden, and we're going to receive 5,000 calories from what we've planted, then that's a good trade-off. If we're having to put like a bunch of energy into it, if we're putting 5,000 calories into it and we're only receiving 5,000 calories back, it's kind of, we're wasting our time with it.
Yeah.
And so when we start to live in harmony with these natural cycles, when we start to live in harmony with the calendar, we're getting a better result. We're getting more bang for our buck, as it were. And this makes us feel good. It's the same with being in harmony with your own energy. If you are here to be a poet, or you're here to be a leader, or you're here to be a lawyer even, there are certain signs that will coordinate with law, or they'll coordinate with the arts, or they'll coordinate with gardening. And you know, when we work with that energy, we're finding our natural balance. We might be finding what the Japanese phrase ikigai would be all about, our life purpose.
Right.
Because, you know, it's like, we might really want to be a rock star, but if we can't play guitar and we can't sing, then we're not going to have much of a career with it. We're going to find it frustrating. We're not really doing it for the world, because maybe our destiny was to be a farmer. And I think we also kind of like recognize that food producers, hopefully in the last few months, should have been put back into the position that they once enjoyed, of people who are really important to society. There was once a bumper sticker that I saw, I think it was in England, it said something like, "Don't criticize farmers with your mouth full." You know, it's kind of like we take for granted our food supply.
Yeah.
And now we realize that these people keeping working while everybody else couldn't go out or whatever is vital to us, vital to our food sovereignty. And
Absolutely.
so, you know, we can see things with a new light. And I think, again, this is something which we may have seen in the last few months. Things have been put back into balance. The priorities have been corrected to understanding who really is important in our society.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. It's still underway, I feel, you know, because there's people who are definitely still going back to sleep on a certain level as well, you know, but it's evolving. And there's beyond a shadow of a doubt, we're, you know, people have awakened on a level they never have before, which is great. I love all of that, all that you've shared around the calendar. And I feel like, you know, it is that ancient wisdom, isn't it, of the ancestors? It's a tried and tested method or map, right? And of course, you know, it's not going to be the same in those cycles of time. It will be a new dynamic, but the baseline energy is what you're saying is kind of what you're working on in those cycles. And I also feel like it gives hope, doesn't it, and empowers people in order to see that these cycles of time, you know, they move and they change and they shift, and that you're not going to be stuck in that horrendous, if it's a challenging cycle of time, that there's always movement through.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think that one of the things that we have to do in one way is to look up. And I'd always encourage people to look up at the sky anyway. You know, it's one of my passions. But when I say look up, we can become very myopic with regards to who we are and where we are. We can become very focused on, like, it's all well and good to be living in the now, but we also need to retain our perspective of where we're going and what's going on. And when we look at it, you know, when we look at what maybe our grandparents went through during, for example, the Second World War, the hardships that people would have gone through, the moral fiber that often those communities had as a sense of, or, you know, as a result of community bonding through going through a hardship together. You know, like when we look at it, many people in the British Isles nearly starved in the late 1930s to the 1940s and that, simply because they couldn't feed the island. There was rationing, and you know, and if it wasn't for that, there was, you know, and all across the, you know, continental Europe and other places as well. You know, you got literally, you didn't know where the next bomb was going to drop, particularly where I came from on the East Coast. You know, I heard all sorts of stories. And it starts you thinking, it starts you putting life into a different perspective. It stops, you know, when we see kind of like, I know here where we've had people who we live in Guatemala, and in some places we really don't have the kind of like the service. And we've seen people kind of like literally have screaming fits because they can't get onto Facebook. That kind of thing, you know, that's where our society has taken us.
Right.
And now we've reevaluated what's really important to us, what's important to our survival. Do we need all of these kind of like subscriptions to this particular entertainment service or that particular entertainment service, when actually there's, you know, get out in your garden, plant some veg rather than watching the entertainment. So, oh, I didn't need that. And I actually got more satisfaction. I got some physical exercise. I connected with my land and all that kind of thing. Going back to a simpler way of life. I think this is an opportunity that we have right now.
And to ritual as well is a big part of it, right? Which I know you utilize in your life there.
Yes. And this is something which, you know, when we look at what the ancients were doing, when we look at marking the days and really putting our energy into marking the days of a natural count, and one of the things that we use, you know, the term Ajq'ij means he of the days, or he of the sun. And it refers to somebody, when you say he of, now many years ago in Britain, we might have called somebody Mr. Baker because their occupation was a baker, or, you know, like Mrs. Seamstress or something like that. You know, you'd be referred to by your occupation. And when we call them, we might even call them master baker, because they own the bakery. They're the one that has all the knowledge, the skill, and all that kind of thing. And when we called them master baker, it was not like, oh, he's a master baker. It's like accepting and referencing their skill, their knowledge, the practical application of all those kind of things. So Ajq'ij is seen as somebody who is of the calendar, who is of the sun, who is of the day, and who has an understanding of the way to navigate time. The navigator on the ship. Now, everybody on the ship needs to do their job. We've got the captain, we got the engine room, you got Scotty in the engine room or whatever, you know, all of that kind of thing. We also have the navigator. The navigator is going to advise the captain on which course to set or whatever, you know, all of that.
Yes.
And we all work together as a team. We all work together harmoniously. So, firstly, you have somebody who is the understanding of the navigation of time. Now, one of the other roles, in particular, okay, you're navigating time to understand when to plant your crops. You're navigating time in order to understand when to get married, when to conceive. This was a very important thing.
Of course, yeah.
And there are other things within there. And the understanding of when to make ceremony was also seen as being very important. The ceremonies are held in order to bring balance. The ceremonies are held in order to nourish the community energetically. And what I see each altar as being is rather like an antenna. And that antenna is creating a standing wave of harmony, because we're connecting with the land, we're connecting with our essence, we're connecting with the Noelis, we're feeding them. And in that way, we're bringing a wave of harmony to the local community. Now, the more altars that you have, you imagine, probably this is not necessarily the best analogy to draw, but with a cell phone network, you need the cell phone towers to make up that network so that you don't lose signal going from one area to the next. So if we take away that and we imagine those as being altars, which are regularly fed, which regularly have ceremonies made of them, they're creating a standing wave of harmony, which is covering the land and helping everybody within that area to become harmonized with the land through the work that we do at the altars. Now, of course, I'll make ceremony for people that they maybe need healing, maybe they need a cleansing ritual, maybe they need something kind of like to help their family or something like that.
Right.
That's a possibility, and that's some of the ceremonies that we make. But we also make general ceremonies to honor the land through the calendar. So, for example, we might be honoring we might go through Mosh, which is a celebration of the waters, a celebration of the lake, and of course we couldn't exist without the waters. Right. We might make a celebration for Ajq'ij, which is a celebration of the spirit of Mother Earth. And so the ceremonies give us an opportunity to give thanks for what we've received, to ask for pardon for when we've been human.
Yes.
And to ask for what we want. And this is something which I think that, I don't know, maybe through our upbringing or something like that, we're often kind of like told, oh, you mustn't ask. No, that you've got to be humble. It's like, no. So you've got your site team. I go back to landscaping. I think about, I'm the architect, and I've got the site manager, and I've got the contracts manager, and I've got the QS. They're walking along behind me. Well, this is like your spirit guide and your Nawal and the universe, all walking along beside you, the architect of your reality. And as you're walking along, they're taking notes and saying, oh, she wants that over there. She wants roses over there. She wants turf over there and a line of trees over there. Okay. But when we're not conscious, this is what's going on, that we're co-creating or helping to direct the reality that we're experiencing. We might be using our words in a way where our architects or our our site manager said, did she ask for that? Yeah, I heard it. Sounds a bit weird. I don't think she'll enjoy that. No, I heard her ask. Okay, all right, well, we'll bring that in.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, like, understanding how we work with ceremony helps us to understand that maybe you need a little bit of help. Maybe you need help for your village. Maybe your village needs food, and you can go and ask for that in ceremony. That's what we do. We don't have to ask for ourselves, although we can. There's no rule against it, because each ceremony we're giving back for what we've received. We're asking for what we need right now.
Mm.
We can ask on behalf of anyone or anything.
Mm.
So there are healing ceremonies, there are marriage ceremonies, there are all sorts of different ceremonies. And each ceremony is timed by the calendar. And so, for example, we have 8 Kamei coming up. That's a great day for marriage, because it's about the ancestors and about, when we get married, when we form a lineage by bringing our DNA together, all our ancestors get married as well.
Oh, they do. Yes.
So this is the way that this is kind of seen.
And so it helps appease the ancestors or move them, like help clear anything in the lineages as well. So it brings harmony, I suppose, between the lineages.
Absolutely. It's like a formal introduction. And I think this is also something that, when we, like, for example, when I bought my land here, now I bought it off some very lovely people, but they're also evangelical. And so I couldn't make my own ceremony on my land to ask for permission to build here before I bought it.
You couldn't?
No, because of their beliefs, it would have been out of harmony with the belief of the owner of the land to say, well, can I just make a ceremony and ask for permission to buy it first? I can't do that. So what I did was that once we bought it, we made ceremony to introduce ourselves to take land seriously, because I tell you what, there's a heck of a lot more biomass on this land, and all of that biomass has an energetic field, and so that spirit of the land is bigger than my spirit. And so if I come here and I'm just saying, right, okay, it's my land now, I'm going to put my house here and I'm going to do that, it's like the spirit of the land's going, hang on a minute, you haven't even said hello.
Yeah, no.
So we make the ceremony to introduce ourselves to everything else that exists here. Say, hi, look, we've been brought together now. I'm going to be here. I'd like to build my house up here. I'm Mark. This is what I do. This is how I'm planning to be here. And I hope that we can live together in harmony. And that was on the day Ajq'ij back in 2011. And Ajq'ij is all about creating harmony in the home. And so we timed that ceremony for that day to bring the harmony in, almost as if like a house blessing, but as an introduction to the spirits of the land, to make sure that everybody, everything, every kind of like entity is included within our process.
I love that. So important, Mark. And that can't be stressed enough with anybody working with land or any home space, that is an absolute necessity in my book to offer that ritual ceremonial space and ask permission, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
To look at things not just on the physical level, but on the non-physical level.
Yeah.
Because quite honestly, if you don't get the energy right to begin with, everything else is like the foundation. And if the energy isn't right to begin with, then everything else will eventually fail.
Oh, yes, I hear you. Absolutely. Being a builder's daughter, I've experienced the wrong end of that many times over the years. So I know that when the spirits are disgruntled, it can cause huge harm actually down the line.
Absolutely.
So thank you for doing that work. It's so necessary and has far-reaching effects, even from Guatemala. Just what you're tending in your local environment and in your local life just accentuates out through that portal, that very, very powerful portal. Well, and can I just speak to, because I experienced you in ceremony and I was so grateful to have the opportunity to experience the absolute beauty of fire ceremony that moves through your traditional lineage there, and that you bring, you know, the offerings, the candles, the color, the spirits. There's so much in it, and I can say, you know, I was so deeply touched by that ceremony, and our group that morning in Glastonbury. So I thank you so much for doing that work. It's important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I think that this is maybe also something that we can all do in one way or another. And, you know, okay, so if you come to a traditional Mayan ceremony, you might find that it's sort of like, well, I try and keep it to around about 2 to 3 hours, which, you know, somewhere around about there already sounds long. Sometimes here it might be 4 to 6 hours. It might even go, you know, it's like it's a really, really long thing. But I would personally like to invite everyone to make ceremony for themselves. And ceremony doesn't have to be difficult. It doesn't have to be challenging. It doesn't have to be length. What's important is regularity, in the way that I see it. To just take 5 minutes out of your day, once a week, once a fortnight, or something like that. Light a candle and think of something to be grateful for. Think of something to be forgiven for. And think of something that you'd like to bring into your life. Think of something that you'd like to bring in for the life of your community, for the life of your family. All of those kind of things. You can do it in 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be a big pillar candle. It could be a birthday candle. Right. Because the intention behind it is so strong. And somebody once said to me, look, it doesn't matter what offerings you've got, how many candles, how much copal you use, and all that kind of thing. It's all about what's going on in your heart.
Exactly.
And if you take a moment to connect with, from my point of view, to connect with the flame through your heart, and just honestly give thanks for what you've received, you really notice a massive shift in life. And, you know, I'd encourage everybody to do that. And then, of course, that might lead to kind of like bigger ceremonies and more elaborate things and that kind of thing. But I think one of the things that I love to see is the accessibility. That we don't have to, you know, kind of have this massive training, massive ceremony, massive, you know, just keep it simple, but do it.
Yes.
And watch the change in your life and the change in the lives of people around you, because then you start to act as that beacon of harmony, and your altar starts to act as one of those antennas that's putting that wave, that field of harmony out into your community. And I think that one way or another, you know, I know that they say England's one of the most secular nations on the planet. It's like basically we've forgotten all about the sacred in one way or another. And, you know, when we start to make these ceremonies, when we start to do these things, it brings the richness back into it.
Just breathing that prayer in for all who received this and who have been with us through this beautiful dive into Mayan astrology and the magic there in Guatemala. Thank you so much. I feel like that is a perfect ending to this particular conversation at this point in time. If you feel that you have shared all that wants to come through today, Mark?
Yeah, I think that's where we're at for today.
Yeah, that's beautiful, so powerful, and there's a richness and a depth in there around these cycles of time and all that you are learned in. I'm so grateful for all that you're doing in the world, and I look forward to hopefully getting to Guatemala at some point and, you know, meeting you guys down there and working with the gifts of the land, cacao especially, in its own land space.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And is there anything that you want to bring highlight to with your work at the moment, or that you're offering that maybe people would like to know about?
I think, you know, I have my site, my Facebook page, my YouTube channel. I'm making videos every 13 days, which will guide you through the energy of the sacred calendar, what we call a Trecena, a 13-day period. So they pop up at the beginning of each Trecena to give the guidance for the next 13 days. And so I would say, you know, if Mayan astrology, if Mayan calendars interest you, then you can start with my site or my page. I've got my YouTube channel where the videos are as well. So they're all accessible through the site. And then if that calls you, you dive deeper with a reading. And if that really calls you, then I do a 20-hour course as well about Mayan astrology, where we go into the astronomy and we go into the rituals, we go into a whole bunch of other stuff.
Fabulous.
So kind of like the offerings that I make.
Fantastic. And I receive your newsletter with the daily energies, which is great to have. So people can sign up for that on your website as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, I'm so delighted. Thank you to all of the ancestors and the spirits that are part of your weave there on that sacred land, and, you know, bridging this connection from Ireland. I'm grateful for Spirit bringing us together for this conversation. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Oh.